Does this mean that all governments are good? Does God want us to be in subjective obedience to those ruling over us? Well, let's examine what Paul teaches on this very subject. See, as we enter Romans chapters 12 through to 15, Paul shifts from the theology to ethics. He's laid the foundation of his gospel, as he describes it, rooted in grace, undeserved kindness, faith, and most importantly, the sacrificial death of Jesus. So, now he asks, how should we live in light of this? As we read in Shakespeare's Hamlet, that is the question. Now, Romans chapter 12 calls for a renewed mind, non-conformity with the world, and overcoming evil with good. And chapters 14 and 15 address the community life along those principles that he describes. Respect for differences and unity in the faith. But in the middle of these exhortations sits Romans chapter 13, chapter that has sparked controversy over many centuries. And why? Well, let's find out by reading the first 7 verses of Romans chapter 13, where Paul begins, "Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which is from God. The authorities that exist have been appointed by God, and consequently, whoever resists authority is opposing what God has set in place, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the ones in authority? Then do what is right, and you will have his approval. For he is God's servant for good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not carry the sword in vain. He is God's servant, an agent of retribution to the wrongdoer. So therefore, it is necessary to submit to authority, not only to avoid punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who devote themselves to their work. Pay everyone what you owe him. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due." Now, this statement has led to 2 broad interpretations throughout history. First, Paul supports complete submission to the state, even corrupt ones. And why? Because, as he says, God pointed them to their positions of power. That is what he preached in these first 7 verses. We've just read it. There is another view. That view is that Paul is offering just a limited, pragmatic ethic shaped by time and context. But do we see that in those 7 verses we've just read? Okay, let's consider that second view, the apologetics one, and consider the backdrop now. Okay, Paul writes, or he is writing during the reign of Nero, long before the brutal persecution of the Christians. Now, at this point, Christians were seen really as a sect of Judaism and mostly tolerated. So Paul was advising caution. Don't give the state any reason to attack you. But note his words. the authorities are God's servants for your good. A statement like that is clearly going to come to favorable attention by the authorities, is it not? But does this mean that all governments are good? That seems unlikely, doesn't it? So, what's Paul doing? Is he here using rhetoric, urging peace, but not blind loyalty? Well, some may wish to argue it that way. But do we see any evidence of that in those verses we've just read? However, what if Paul is sincere about this subjection, as the reading so clearly shows? And remember, he is claiming authority from Jesus. So, does this teaching of Paul's align with that of Jesus? Remember, he called Herod that fox and warned that his kingdom was not of this world. We can check that out. Luke chapter 13 and verses 31 and 32. At that very hour, some Pharisees came to Jesus and told him, "Leave this place and get away, because Herod wants to kill you." But Jesus replied, "Go and tell that fox, look, I will keep driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will reach my goal. Nevertheless, I must keep going today and tomorrow and the next day, for it is not admissible for a prophet to perish outside of Jerusalem." Now, not only did he refer to himself as a prophet, but you notice he never submitted uncritically to the earthly powers. He often challenged unjust systems. Remember how he cleansed the temple, and he even accepted death rather than obey corrupt authority. So, Paul's directive seems less revolutionary, shall we say, does it not? See, an apologist would argue perhaps it reflects his strategy to keep the peace among the Jewish and Gentile believers in Rome. Remember, a city that was, after all, under surveillance. However, was he, Paul, following the example of Jesus Christ? Well, you have to judge for yourself. So let's now come to the second half of chapter 13. Note, and you will note, there is a change in direction from submission to the authorities to unity in the congregation. Romans chapter 13 and verses 8 through to 10. This is what he writes. "Be indebted to no one except to one another in love. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and any other commandments are summed up in this one decree: love your neighbor as yourself." Love does no wrong to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Yes, listen carefully. Paul is saying love is the fulfillment of the law. Now, this is a direct echo of Jesus' own teaching that the greatest commandments are love for God and love for neighbor. And here, Paul seems to clarify ultimate loyalty is to the ethics of love. Paul's pivot is profound. Whatever submission he advises in these first seven verses which we've read, he now oriented towards love of one another. Do we see the very clever hand of Perseus and amanuensis here? What do you think? See, in Romans 10, we read, "For Christ is the end of the law to bring righteousness to everyone who believes. Now, the Greek word used is telos. Now, if you go to Strong's, it shows that it means end or completion. Then in the same letter, Romans chapter 6 and verse 4, he makes this statement: for sin shall not be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace. So which is it? Is the law fulfilled in love for one another, chapter 13, verses 8 through to 10? Or is Christ the end of the law, Romans 10 and verse 4? Or are we no longer under law, Romans 6 and verse 14? So what can we draw from Romans chapter 13? You see, Paul urges subjection to the civil authorities, but the higher law of love pertains in the congregation. But then we note rather these contradictory directions in Romans chapter 13 verses 8 to 10, Romans 10 verses 4, and Romans 6 verse 14, all, I might add, in the very same letter to the Romans. So as I see matters, you have to be some kind of academic to try and understand exactly what Paul, is teaching. In 2 Peter 3 and verse 16, this acknowledgement is actually made clear. Check it out, please. This is what he says, the writer. He writes this way in all his letters, speaking of Paul, speaking in them about such matters. Some parts of his letters are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the rest of the scriptures, to their own destruction. Now notice, there is this reference to Paul's letters as being scripture. Now, we're going to leave that for another time. However, for us today, just ordinary folks, not academians, is not Romans 13 a license for blind submission to the civil authorities? They are, after all, God's instrument. He has set in place them for our benefit. That is according to Paul. What do you think Paul meant in Romans 13? Does obedience to authority always align with following Jesus? Let us know in the comments. And if this has helped you think more deeply, don't forget to subscribe for more exploration of the mind of Christ. Now, we're going to be moving on to series 4. And next week, we will introduce that with showing a framework of how the series will progress, with a shorter video tying to the subject matter and then followed by the longer one. So thank you, and see you next Tuesday and next Thursday each week. Thank you very much.